Another video. Today we're going to be talking about a DPS tier list for every tier of Wrath of the Lich King. This was requested by one of the commenters in a last video, so we're going to go ahead and break this down by tier. Do keep in mind that this tier list is intended for Classic Wrath, so it's for the whole perspective of a Wrath server. With keeping that in mind, we're thinking a pre-nerf state of 3.3.5 raids. And last thing to keep in mind is all this is subject to change. We really don't know what's going to happen when we get our hands on the Wrath Classic beta and can get our hands on what all these classes have, all these nuances, and all these weird little bugs and tricks that we have with all these classes, just to see how it's actually going to shake down. But this is going to be my tier list for DPS in every single tier of Wrath. So let's go for it. This first one that we're looking at is tier 7. And real quick, I just want to note, this tier list that I'm using today, it had all the specs in it, so you can just ignore this bottom part right here with Tank and Heal, and then this bottom part right here with Subtlety Rogue, Frost Mage, and BM Hunter. These are just specs that you don't bring in PvE. They are not viable. No one uses them. Maybe you can do some damage as Frost Mage, and maybe you can do some damage as BM Hunter, but it is the worst DPS spec of these pure DPS classes. The only reason you would ever consider a BM Hunter is if you don't have an Arcane Mage, and you don't have a Retribution Paladin, and your Fire Mage doesn't want to go Arcane, and you really just feel like having that 3% extra damage for your raid, then you'd have your Hunter go BM, but even then, like, it's just a meme spec. So let's forget about these 3 specs existing, and we'll move forward. So for tier 7, in our S tier, we have Affliction Warlock. We have Demo Lock. We have Arcane Mage, Frost DK, Assassination Rogue. Honestly, maybe I have these icons mixed up. Maybe this is Assassination and this is Combat. Honestly, I'm not a big Rogue guy, so can't really tell you. But I'm going to assume that this is Assassination and this is Combat, because I'm not 100% sure. This is Enhance, Feral. In our A tier, we have Unholy. We have our Survival Hunter. B tier, we have Elemental Shaman, Shadow Priest, Retribution Paladin. This is our Combat Rogue. We have Fire Mage in C tier with our Arms Warrior and Boomkin. D tier is going to be Fury Warrior, Destro Lock, and Marksman Hunter. Now let me just explain some of this real quick. What's nice is our Demo Lock is actually really strong in tier 7. Possibly stronger than Affliction Lock. Possibly the strongest DPS spec for a lot of these fights. Especially considering in tier 7, a lot of these fights are going to be done really quick. The boss HP is pretty low, and Demo Lock has really good CDs to burst and get huge openers, and to just get a lot of pump going out early. Affliction Lock is our Execute DPS. They do so much damage in an Execute phase that they are better on these customly buffed private servers that we might be used to, where bosses have high HP values. But they're also really good just in later fights. In tier 8, tier 10, your Affliction Lock is going to continue to be really strong because those fights get harder and harder. So keep in mind that this is probably the weakest point of your Affliction Lock, despite still being one of the best DPS in the game. Now your Arcane Mage is also going to be a huge DPS in tier 7. I mean, their CDs are just super front loaded, and the shorter the fight, the better. Your Arcane Mage is going to absolutely blast in tier 7. And they're going to fall off a cliff, as you'll see later on. Frost DK does not need much to be strong. The DPS that they need, or the stats that they get just from pre-raid BIS, are so strong, and their kit is just so strong early that they don't need a lot of gear to scale. They really don't. You don't need Armor Pin to do well as a Frost DK, and you don't need any big trinkets. You don't need any big weapons. Your Frost DK is just a really strong early DPS. Enhance, fantastic DPS early. I think people are sleeping on Enhance, especially your Spell Hance. They're going to have really good single target, and they have really good effective cleave. So those patchwork fights are going to be really strong. Unfortunately, for fights like Grobulus, where you're maybe moving a lot, EOE is going to be kind of rough. But Enhance is still probably an S tier, maybe A tier DPS. But you'll see Spell Hance popping off in the top 3 DPS of your raids quite often. Your Feral Druid, probably the highest single target DPS in the game. And this goes for almost every single tier. If you have one Feral Druid in your raid, you will see them constantly in the top 5 of your DPS, maybe the top 1 if it's a patchwork style fight. So keep in mind this Feral is probably going to keep their spot in the S tier for the entirety of the expansion. And then, of course, Assassination Rogue is going to be amazing in Tier 7. You could just show up to raid with some paper cutters, and you're going to blast. You'll be perfectly fine single target. The rotation is probably one of the easiest rotations in the game, and they will sustain very, very high single target damage for a long time. Now, next in A tier, I have Unholy. Unholy just slightly off of Frost DK in this tier. Really, it's not by much. I just got to give the hand to Frost because Frost doesn't need to scale at all. Unholy's going to pick up a lot of gear this tier, and they will take off soon. But there's just not enough fights where Unholy's going to shine. Like, sure, they might shine a bit on Obsidian Sanctum, but all these fights are going to be really short, not very cleave reliant, and your Unholy is just going to be in a weird spot in Tier 7. Still extremely, extremely strong. Do not get me wrong. And of course, your Survival Hunter is actually really good in Tier 7. Definitely really good. I think people sleep on Survival, especially with how simple these fights are. They're going to be able to easily trap weave on it. You'll see Survival doing really, really well in Tier 7. Another one that I think gets slept on is Elemental Shaman. I've seen some Elemental Shamans in my day blast some pretty big numbers. You can go ahead and ask any of these big raiders that have Elemental Shamans in their raid that they can do really well in Tier 7. Unfortunately, they have a problem similar to Arcane Mages. They don't scale. They really don't. So you might see your Elemental Shaman fall off a cliff here pretty soon. But they do pretty decent in Tier 7. Unfortunately, their problem is once you get into like Tier 8 or even just late into Tier 7, you don't bring them. There's no reason to bring them. You have your Demo lot covering their same exact buff, doing more damage than in the same exact role. You don't need an Elemental Shaman in your raid. Shadow Priest going to be in a pretty decent spot in Tier 7. Let's try to speed this up. And Ret Paladin as well. Combat Rogue still needs a little bit more to get going before they come online. Your Fire Mage is just missing so much. Your Arcane Mage gets so much hit from their talents. So Fire Mage is not only missing hit that they have to get from gear, but they're missing a lot of crit at this point in the game. There's not enough crit to go around for them to really come online in their kit. So they're a C tier DPS in Tier 7, but trust me, Fire Mage is going to pick back up soon. Arms Warrior is definitely going to be the best of the two Warrior specs at this point. They'll definitely do more DPS than a Fury, unless the fight just lends itself to Fury more, like maybe a noob. But Arms is going to be better for Warrior right now. And your Boomkin is going to be a C tier DPS. And no need to go into Marksman or Destro. They are just not ready to be used right now. Now in Tier 8, Ulduar, things shake up a whole lot. First thing right off the bat, you see your Fire Mage go exactly from a C tier DPS to an S tier DPS. Fire Mage, I believe it's 4-piece. Once they get their 4-piece tier, they just come fully online. You pretty much kick Arcane to the dust. The only time you'd ever use Arcane in Tier 8 is maybe on a fight like General Vezax. But even then, you probably have too much DPS. So unless you're just trying to go for a really big parse, you don't even need to respec Arcane. But it would be really good on Vezax, and that's pretty much it. Fire's just going to be way too ready, way too mobile, and doing a lot more DPS than Arcane for these longer fights as well. Now your Unholy moves up to S tier. Unholy comes more online in Tier 8. The tier set bonus works really well for them, and as well as some of the trinkets like Comet's Trail coming in. Definitely going to be huge for your Unholy DK. Feral's going to keep its spot in S tier, and of course so is Affliction. Survival is going to be another A tier in this tier. Demo lock falling off a bit because of these fights on the way that they're set up. Combat Rogue going to be coming up, and Assassination Rogue going to be falling down just to meet each other in this A tier. Definitely a toss-up between the two in Tier 8. I think most rogues will be leaning towards going combat because Assassination doesn't bring anything at all to the raid, and your combat at least brings improved exposed armor. And then your Enhance is just going to be an A tier in this phase. Nothing wrong with Enhance, absolutely at all. Nothing wrong with it at all. They're just getting outclassed by a few other classes right now. Again, your Shadow Priest and Ret going to still be a B tier. In C tier, we got your Arms and your Fury Warrior. Fury Warrior coming up a bit more on their scaling. You could switch to Fury if you wanted to with your Brown, but that's assuming that you have someone to fill that Arms gap, that debuff that they bring. Boomy's still going to be C tier. Again, Arcane Mage going from S all the way down to C, just because they're being swapped out so easily by that huge scaling by Fire. So they're just going to drop down to C. Nothing wrong with Arcane. Again, you want to stick with that until you get the gear or the tier set for it. Marksman coming up. If you really need Marksman, it's going to be a little bit more viable in tier 8. And then your Elemental Shaman, they do okay in tier 8. They really do, but it's nothing. It's nothing too sexy. It's nothing to see here. I mean, just stick with your demo lock. You don't need an Elemental Shaman in your raid. You can take one if you want one, if you have one, but you don't need them. Destro Lock is still going to be a D tier. Honestly, I think they're D tier for every single tier here, if you want to know spoilers. But your Destro Lock can be used for a couple fights. They're really, really, really good on Vezex, even though you probably don't need them. And they're pretty good on Hodir. But that's it. And those two fights alone aren't important hard modes for anyone. Those hard modes are pretty easy to hit, and you won't want your Destro for any of the other fights that actually matter. They're terrible for Firefighter. They're absolutely terrible for Firefighter, and you don't want them on Algalon either. Alright, moving on to Tier 9. Tier 9, the only change with S tier is we're bringing Combat Rogue up into S tier. Combat is just so ready, scaling into such a comfortable spot, and they are just so fantastic on a noob. Honestly, a lot of this is intended for a noob fight, because a noob is the fight of Tier 9. We don't worry too much about any of the other fights in TOGC, and we don't worry about Onyxia, because all those are so easy. A Noobercon, or a Nooberak is the only fight that really matters in Tier 9. And your Combat Rogue is just fantastic for it. Now, Assassination is still pretty decent. They keep really high single target numbers. They always will. But your combat's going to have some fantastic cleave, and cleave is really important. You want sustained, easily accessible cleave that isn't something like channeling a volley or channeling a blizzard or a flame strike. You want someone who can cleave easily. These Death Knights will always be really fantastically strong for that fight as well. Demo Lock, again, still going to be really good. I really encourage people to just pursue this spec. Demo Lock is a lot of fun, and they're good through the whole entire expansion. They're only slightly worse than Affliction Lock for most things, and you're going to get funneled all the gear. Now, at this point, Fury is really taking a step up. Fury is really strong on a noob. Don't sleep on Fury at all. This is the point in the entire expansion where Fury is definitely overtaking Arms. If you want to pump as Warrior, you are going Fury at this point. You will have a lot of armor pin at your disposal through gear in Tier 9, and you want to start funneling your Fury Warrior, because in Tier 10 they take off. So make sure your Fury Warrior is online and ready in Tier 9. In the B tier, Hunters are probably in their worst place in the entire expansion. Tier 9 is not a very good Hunter tier. There's not a lot to choose from. You can start switching to Marksman if you want, although I would wait until maybe you get some triggers from ICC, but we're going to go with a B tier for these two Hunters in Tier 9. Again, Ret and Shadow Priest are going to still be B tier here. You got your Arms in C tier, still with your Boomy. Arcane Mage is just completely forgotten about. There's no need to have Ellie, and you definitely don't want Destro. Now, for Tier 10, and keep in mind, this is a perspective of, I'm approaching Tier 10 fresh. This is a Tier 10 fresh. This isn't Tier 10 that has been farmed constantly over and over again. This is fresh Tier 10. We don't have Bisc gear yet. This is a progression Tier 10 of ICC. I'm saying that these are the S tier DPS for Tier 10. We got our Affliction Lock, Fire Mage, Feral Still, we have our Combat Rogue, and we have our Fury Warrior that is fully online, ready to blast. We still have our A tier Demo Lock. Our DKs are now falling down to A tier. DKs really, at this point, Frost is going to have a lot of armor pin and will definitely be able to pump single target, but they're just not the same class that they used to be in other tiers. Frost falls off a lot in Tier 10. It just gets outscaled by other people, which is fine. Your Unholy, their best tier is actually in Tier 9, so their best place is in Tier 9. Unfortunately, moving into Tier 10, they will get some off-piece upgrades, but in terms of pure scaling, they've kind of hit their ceiling. Your Unholy is going to be fantastic for your Lich King fight, but still, you want to bring them, but they're not as good as they used to be. Your Rep Paladin at this point takes off a bit. Your Rep Paladin is going to get a huge tier set bonus in Tier 10. That makes them so much better Rep Paladin is a lot better. Honestly, you could maybe even throw them into S tier, but I'm going to keep them as an A tier DPS just for this tier sake purposes. And then, of course, your Marksman Hunter. Your Marksman Hunter is definitely the premier Hunter spec of tier 10. Survival has fallen off too much, and your Hunter is going to have a lot of armor pin that they can use in Marksman for sure. Shadow Priest still going to be a B tier. You still want your Shadow. Assassination Rogue at this point, still really high single target damage. Going to be great for those Fester Gut fights. But why not just take a combat rogue? And most guilds are going to have only one rogue anyway. If you have two, sure, one of them can go assassination, so that way they aren't competing so much for the same gear. But I just wouldn't recommend it. There's no point in having them. But if you have assassination, trust me, they're still going to do really great single target damage, just like they have been for the entire expansion. Just other classes at this point are outscaling them. In my opinion, your Enhance is falling off a bit. A lot of these really important fights, like Professor Putricide, and for Lich King, your Enhance just has to move too much, which means their Magma Totems are always falling behind, and their effective cleave is also like being missed out a lot. Enhance is still going to be really good, don't get me wrong. And you can still mess around with the theory crafting of the whole spell enhance versus regular DPS enhance, plus like an armor pin enhance. There's so many ways you can build enhance at this point in the game in tier 10, but they're just not in the place that they used to be. Again, Arms Warrior are going to be C tier here. You can still go Arms and you can still pump. Honestly, maybe Arms is an A tier DPS, but people don't really play it. At this point, all your warriors are going to be Fury and being funneled Shadowmourne, and you don't really go Arms in this tier. Boomy's still going to be C tier. Survival falls all the way down to C tier. Again, there's no need to have Arcane. Elemental's probably in the worst part of the game that it's ever been in tier 10. And you can run Destrolock, sure, and maybe it falls into an actual like C tier DPS, but it's the worst DPS spec of the pure DPS class of Warlock, and it's going to be a D tier for me. Now that is all the tiers for Wrath. We've covered all tier 7, tier 8, and tier 9. There's definitely a lot of movement that's happened. Our Fury Warriors have gone from a D tier spec all the way to an A tier spec in tier 10. Looking back on tier 7, we can see our Survival Hunter falls off a bit from an A tier all the way down to a C tier. And we can see Fire Mage from C tier all the way up to an S tier. So definitely keep in mind that there's a lot of movement, and this is all just my opinion, so take it all with a big grain of salt. Everything is subject to change once we get our hands on the Wrath Classic Beta. But this is what I'm going to say from my experience on, what now, 6 different Wrath private servers? Maybe 7 at this point. I can't even keep track. But this is my opinion of the DPS tier list for all of Wrath. Thanks, guys, for listening. We will have some more content in the future, but for now, that is it. Thanks. Peace.